Hello and welcome to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Min San Hee with our group of foreign journalists. It's good to see you all.
Nice to be back, thanks.
Now, it's 2017 and the new year has begun, so perhaps we can start the program with a few words on your New Year's resolution. We'll start with you, Fred.
I think I will try to find a way to write better articles and spend more time with my family. Won't be easy, but
I see. Right. Elise, what about you?
I usually do the same thing. I try to read more and write more. So I'm going to try and read fewer blogs and more books.
Frank.
That's a good resolution. I think I'm going to try to be a lazier journalist. Actually, the last 3 months I've been working so much that I haven't had that much time for my family and stuff, and hopefully we'll have a bit less eventful 2017.
Right. In our first episode for the new year, we delve into an issue of universal concern, one that we hope to see little of in 2017. Terrorism in Europe has authorities there on high alert as they seek to keep their citizens safe from these random acts of violence. We have details in this report. On December 19, 2016, chaos broke out at a Christmas market in Berlin. A large truck plowed into the market, crashing into crowds of shoppers. 12 people were killed and 48 injured. Right after the incident, the suspect, Anis Amri, fled to Italy, and on December 23rd, he was fatally shot by the local police.
Tutte le indagini che si fanno in questo caso, senza ombra di dubbio, Anis Amri.
On the same day, the extremist Islamic group IS claimed responsibility for the attack and released a video of Anis Amri pledging his allegiance to the group. The year 2016 was tainted by terrorist attacks. In March, a serial bomb attack in Brussels killed roughly 30 people, while in June, a suicide bomb attack at Ataturk Airport in Istanbul, Turkey, left some 40 people dead. The following month, a truck crashed into crowds in Nice, claiming the lives of 86 people.
We've seen people holding babies, screaming, shouting, mothers running for cover. It was horrendous.
The attacks were not limited to Europe. In June, the deadliest mass shooting in US history took place at a nightclub in Orlando, leaving more than 100 victims either dead or injured. With the holiday season full of events and festivals, countries around the world took extra precautions to prevent any potential terrorist attacks. Police and soldiers across Europe tightened security and stepped up inspections. But despite these stronger measures, entering the new year, another terrorist attack hit a nightclub in Istanbul, killing some 36 people. The world has seen the continual rise of random acts of violence as it struggles to find ways to curb terrorism. Fred, you're currently based in Korea, so I'm going to assume that you didn't cover the Nice attack last July, but I'm sure your media organization did. The attack came less than a year after the attack in Paris in the year 2015. I'm going to assume the people there were still trying to come to terms with the earlier attack.
yeah, exactly. People were, of course, in a state of shock and a bit despair, like, not once again, how can this be possible? And actually the reaction after the attack of the French society as a whole was a bit worrying, I would say. First, on the political side, we saw many right politicians making strong comments, asking for very strong militaristic measures, and we did actually, France increase its bombing on the Islamic State. And as well, among the society, we saw more like anti-Muslim declaration, anti-Muslim acts, some mosques being attacked. So the atmosphere was a bit toxic, a bit nasty, and still the case. I'm worried, yeah.
Right. Elise, there was a shocking shooting case in Orlando in a nightclub there last June. A security guard, 29-year-old, he killed about 49 people. The authorities there claim that this attack was the deadliest in the U.S. soil since the September 11 attacks in 2001. What was the reaction of the public?
Well, it certainly depends on how you view these lone gunman attacks. I mean, America has been plagued by mass shootings, and there is a lot of subjectivity in what you define as terrorism. And so if you were to consider this a terrorist attack, then absolutely very deadly and continues a stream of problems in American society with how to deal with mass shootings. And so it sort of hits two fissures in society at once, both mass shootings and the fear that is sort of sowed by terrorism in general.
Frank, tell us a bit about the campaign against terrorism in Canada. I understand the country is preparing to celebrate its 150th birthday this year, and security has been ramped up in the capital, Ottawa.
Yes, it has. At Parliament Hill, they've instituted some other measures to increase security there, given the special anniversary of the 150 years since Confederation. And right now, this kind of the debate that's taking place about these security measures has to do something also with the foreign policies of our new Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who's withdrawn Canada from the military attack measures on IS and in Syria and in the Middle East, and continued to provide support and also move more towards providing humanitarian assistance in other levels. Also, Canada has increased its acceptance of refugees. Over the past year, Canada has received something like 35,000 refugees, and that has related to this debate about security in Canadian society, because there is a worry that we're getting more involved in this in another way, and some of these refugees may turn out to be, in fact, intending to do harm to Canadians. And that has been part of, again, this debate about security on Canadian soil.
2016 in general saw more than its fair share of terrorist attacks. Is there a reason, do you believe, for this surge in the number of such sickening acts of violence against ordinary citizens?
Civil war. Civil war is directly linked to terrorism across the Middle East and Afghanistan. Last year was 15 years post President George W. Bush's declaration of the war on terrorism, in which he famously sort of promised that he would eradicate all terror from the globe, when it's actually gone the opposite direction. And it's gone the opposite direction, as most experts believe, because you have both groups with capability and grievance in places like Iraq, like Afghanistan, like Yemen, Saudi Arabia, all these places in which Syria, where there's a lot of discord within the countries themselves. And so, those of us in the West have actually seen a very proportionately much smaller degree of terrorism in our daily lives than places in the Middle East, and we cannot forget that, because I feel like in all the sowing of fear around terrorism, it's always about the West, like America makes it about America, when it's really not. It's about the civil wars going on in the places where there's some serious strife about who's going to lead them.
Part of the purpose of terrorism is to get that media coverage. And there is the sort of maxim of journalism, if it bleeds, it leads, and that tendency to want to put that on the front page. And the type of news coverage that people need is a more comprehensive perspective of terrorism and its consequences. And I think we need to look at what we're doing in the West in terms of our foreign policy and the generation of these grievances against our countries. They do not take place in a vacuum. There's been a serious debate about this in the United States for almost 20 years, especially since 9/11. And you've seen it in presidential debates. I point to Rand Paul debating with Mayor Giuliani when he said, there's a reason why that happened. There's a source of those grievances, and it's American foreign policy that has generated those grievances against the United States. And if that policy was changed and a more humanitarian and less militaristic foreign policy was instituted by the United States, those grievances would be less. And post 9/11, with the war on terror, those grievances only increased. And other countries that participate in America's war on terror, again, they are going to bear the brunt of those grievances. At the same time, I'm not justifying at all what happened or, terrorism as a strategy of foreign policy. At the same time, we need to look at Western countries need to look at what they're doing in terms of their reaction to terrorism and their perhaps fomentation of terrorism in their response to it.
Do you foresee a similar scenario in the year 2017?
I wouldn't like to predict that there's going to be any terrorism, and I would hope that there wouldn't be. At the same time, I do hope that our governments work hard on sort of a more preventative level in one aspect, and in another aspect in terms of our foreign policy, those countries that are struggling with internal strife, that we work more in a more humanitarian way to try to generate democracy in those countries and deal with terrorism in a non-militaristic manner as much as possible.
Experts claim there's been a shift in the target and technique of terrorism in recent years as assailants focus on soft targets. We have details in this report. Terrorism uses many different forms of violence to instill fear in society. Since 2000, the fear of terrorism has spread across the globe. On September 11th, 2001, Islamic militant group Al-Qaeda carried out a series of attacks in the US. After hijacking 4 airliners, the terrorists crashed into the World Trade Center buildings in New York City and into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., leaving nearly 3,000 people dead. In March 2004, simultaneous bombings on Madrid commuter trains in Spain killed 191 people and injured over 1,800. In July 2005, a series of bombs went off in London, killing over 50 people. In 2009, in Russia, explosives were detonated under a high-speed train, leaving nearly 30 people dead. And in 2014, 3 Koreans lost their lives in a tourist bus bombing in Egypt. Meanwhile, in January 2015, Islamic extremists opened fire in the Paris office of the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. And 8 months later, on November 13th, simultaneous shootings and bomb blasts occurred at 6 separate sites in Paris, including concert halls and a sports stadium, killing at least 130. The prevailing trend in these terrorist attacks, seen since the turn of the century, can be summed up with the term soft targets. This refers to attacking civilians who are unprotected and vulnerable. The Berlin terror attack on December 19th is an example that highlights this trend. Also, lone wolf terrorism carried out by individuals without direct ties to terrorist groups has evolved to wolfpack terrorism coordinated by a number of local assailants. The forms in which terrorist attacks take place are constantly changing, leaving many people at unease about what to expect next. Now, as we just saw in the report, there have been numerous cases of such alarming attacks against ordinary people in the 21st century. Now, I'm sure this question might be slightly inappropriate given the fact that such atrocities have always claimed the lives of loved ones. But which attack remains most difficult to forget for you?
For me, it was definitely, I think, the one that touched me the most was the Bataclan attack, this concert hall in Paris in November 2015. Just because it could have been my family, it could have been my friends. I have many friends who live in this area. My brother was supposed to go to this concert hall 2 days after the attack. So it could really have been anybody. And this attack really touched my generation. And I still have to come into terms with that. It's still very painful, actually, even though I didn't know anybody.
Right. What about you, Elise?
The first one in my memory was Oklahoma City, the Oklahoma City bombing in it was like 1994, so I had to have been in junior high at the time, middle school. And so I remember sort of first coming into consciousness about reading magazines and news, and so that was when I first was even aware of such acts, right? What an act of terrorism was. But as an American, of course, the one that shaped all of us and sort of affected my generation was 9/11 for the sheer propensity of the crime, some 3,000 people dead. And so, and then there's so many of, as a Washington journalist too, there's so many of my colleagues who actually witnessed the plane coming down at the Pentagon, and so obviously that's the height of our consciousness.
For me, it'll always be 9/11. I was here in South Korea when that happened. I was watching on TV. I informed some people that it was happening with some phone calls, and I'll always remember wondering when it was going to end and watching it sort of unfold that day, and just the uncertainty and fear that was generated that day. I'll never forget.
Yeah, I'll have to agree with you there. I was a year into my job when that happened. It was quite shocking. It felt really surreal. Terrorism occurs in many places across the globe. We talked about this earlier on. But Europe in recent years is emerging as a frequent target. Do you believe there's a reason for this, Fred?
We have now in France a lot of young people that are sometimes not even from like Muslim parents, who just become Muslim, become radicalized, and some of them are looking for a cause. There is a lot of frustration in their life, and they decide to go to Syria. And France, I think, is one of the European countries that send most of these young people, young women, to like Islamic State strongholds in Syria. And I think that's the reason why now we see some of these kids are coming back. Some of these kids, they are setting up like organization to attack France.
Right. And France has been bearing the brunt of the most brutal forms of aggression.
Yeah, recently, yes.
Elise, you talked about this earlier, but there is a lot of the terrorist attacks that are occur in the Middle East. If I were to ask you to point to a difference perhaps in the terrorism in the Middle East and that happening in Europe?
It's just like robbery. I mean, you can do it if it's convenient for you to do it, right? And so it's easier to perform these acts when it comes to the lack of a security threshold, or the lack of consequences, and the lack of infrastructure in general. And so when you're not sure about whether you're going to have electricity at night or if your family is safe, then what's to really stop you from a suicide bombing, and especially if you're radicalized too, and there's religious reasons for this.
Usually there is much more terror attacks in the Middle East, but they're usually less deadly. Like in terms of a number of casualty, there is much fewer attacks in Europe, but they are much more deadly. And I think they have, for us, since we are in Europe, they have a much stronger impact. And that leads to political consequences. 9/11 was a successful operation by the terrorists because it helped to spread even more terrorism.
Right. The report we just saw also mentioned terrorism by lone wolves. These people who prepare and commit such atrocities alone without a command structure, without material assistance from a terrorist group. What do you believe, Frank, drives these individuals forward?
Well, I think what we've seen in the Middle East is an acceptance of terrorism as a method of war by some groups. And I think that these lone wolf attacks that are inspired by these groups, those individuals have been radicalized, as Fred mentioned, and can act out their radical ideas against other people by performing violent acts.
I think it's very problematic because it's very difficult to prevent such kind of attack. And I think we always had some young people who have problems, who have imbalance, who are ready to do crazy things. It's just now radical Islam give them a way to or ideas, or give them a structure through which they can do deadly things.
Right. The repercussions of a terrorist attack extend far and beyond. But what do you believe is one of the most severe ramifications of terrorism?
Fear. I mean, terrorism directly breeds fear. Fear then breeds nativism, xenophobia, closing of borders, racism, prejudice, bigotry, all of these things that sort of then create massive fissures in society and political upheaval.
I think that's the most serious consequence. There's analysis of the economic consequences of terrorism. 9/11 was trillions of dollars, and then the reaction to that, the war on terror and everything that followed, that cost trillions of dollars. And there's such a thing called the broken window fallacy, where people say, well, if you break a window and then you fix it, that's good. So war, in a way, generates income for people, maybe for those that own war bonds or that are part of the military-industrial complex, but that represents a huge loss of investment that could take place in other areas, and that's something that I'd like to see, less sort of militaristic responses to terrorist activities and more humanistic responses to it.
We turn our focus now to national boundaries to assess how safe Korea is from these random acts of aggression. Asia was once considered to be relatively safe from terrorist attacks, but that is no longer the case. On July 1st last year, the Islamic State lodged an attack on a restaurant in Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. It ended with over 20 people dead, including many foreigners. 7 Japanese victims lost their lives, the largest loss among Asian countries.
今回の残虐非道なテロによって何の罪もない多くの方々の命が奪われました。強い憤りを覚えます。
Korea so far has been seen as relatively removed from the threats of extremist violence. But in January 2016, the National Intelligence Service revealed that 7 foreigners who had worked in Korea joined the Islamic State, fueling concerns about terrorism. In June, it was also revealed that Korean civilians and US military facilities in the country were named targets of the IS. And earlier in November 2015, a propaganda video purportedly released by IS also listed Korea as being part of the global coalition against the Islamic State. All things considered, Korea no longer appears to be isolated from the global threat of terrorism. Right, so what are the chances of terrorism in Korea?
I think South Korea is really quite safe. One of the things that you need to recognize is South Korea is a virtual island. So the points of arrival here are very easily controlled, relatively easily controlled by the government and border police and customs officials and things like that. Whereas Europe is absolutely porous, and it's easy for people seeking to do Europe hard to cross its borders, and I think that's why you see more terrorism there as well.
Now, given the tensions on the Korean peninsula, what are the chances of perhaps a terrorist attack against South Korea by North Korea?
Well, I think that would be sort of crossing the line, and I don't think North Korea wants to get into that. I think it would cause a deterioration in inter-Korean relations far beyond what we've seen in the so-called provocations along the border. Terrorist attack on civilians, a bombing on civilians in Seoul or in South Korea, or something that perpetrated by North Korea, that would be a game changer here and something I don't think North Korea would pursue.
Right. Both you, Frank, and Elise talked about tackling the fundamental elements, the sources of terrorism, the grievances. What do you believe is another fundamental element that we could perhaps address to ensure that such acts do not occur in the future?
In France recently, there is a lot of very interesting reports. They interview a lot of radicalized people who went to Syria and who came back and who regretted what they did, and they explained why they went to Syria. And that was really interesting because it showed that all these young people who decide to become radicalized, there was some kind of a lack of hope, and they were looking for something to do. And I think one of our problems in our society, or maybe I'm talking for the French society, but there is a lack of hope, there is a lack of common cause, there is a lack of drive among many young people who just have no hope at all and who would pick whatever cause is coming. And now these days it's this radical Islam, but maybe we should look in ourselves and maybe find a way to make societies are a little bit more hopeful.
I see. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of this edition of Foreign Correspondents. Before we go, Elise, it's been a while since you've been here. How do you assess today's discussion?
I think it's been a fruitful discussion. This is obviously going to be another era of questions about foreign policy and its effects. ISIS has continued. I mean, we're talking today after a major nightclub attack in Istanbul that's killed more than 40 people, after I think 3 separate attacks in Iraq going on right now just within the last few days. And so we are in the midst of the very topic that we discussed. And so it will be incumbent upon not only the next American president, but global leaders to confront this in a more thoughtful and holistic way.
Right. To usher in the new year in Spain, people make wishes at the stroke of midnight and then proceed to eat 12 grapes for luck, one for each month of the year. In Brazil, people dressed in white throw flowers into the sea for the goddess there to bring them good fortune. Now, the tradition of ushering in the new year may differ depending on the country, but I'm positive that hopes for health and happiness remain universal. Thank you for watching.